Good evening and welcome to this special mental health edition of Doctors on Call. I'm Dina Clabaugh, a psychotherapist and founder of Insight Counseling of Duluth and Virginia, and I will be your host for our program tonight on children's mental health and the pandemic. This is our third of 4 special mental health episodes during this season of Doctors on Call. Our program is here to answer your questions about mental health issues that may affect you, your family, or friends. Please call or email your questions and we will do our best to address them. The telephone numbers and email address can be found at the bottom of your screen. Our expert guests this evening are Dr. Dan Allard, a licensed psychologist with Duluth Psychological Clinic, and Ann Meehan is a licensed professional clinical counselor with MAP Behavioral Health Center in Duluth. Our phone and email questions are being received this evening by members of the WDSE staff who will bring them to me here in the studio. Now let's begin with a discussion of children's mental health and the pandemic. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, Dan and Ann. Thank you for being here. I like to start at the beginning with you having an opportunity to introduce yourselves a little bit more, talk about your practice and areas of specialty and kind of what you're passionate about. So Ann, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I'm Ann Meehan. I'm a therapist over at MAP Behavioral Health Center in Duluth, and I work with kids and children ages 4 and up. That is really my specialty. And I work with lots of different kids with, I like to say, big emotions. So kids that get anxious or kids that are a little bit angry. I do a lot of different types of therapy, like play therapy, and also therapy that specifically focuses on trauma.
Thank you. And Dan?
Sure, Dan Allard. I work at the Duluth Psychological Clinic, mostly with adults, and then I work at Northwood Children's Services in the Diagnostic Center with children and families. I wouldn't say I have a specialty, but by choice, but I have a specialty lately in helping families and children adjust to these unusual circumstances we've been in the last 2 years. So a lot of trauma and sort of chronic stressor focus recently, which is apt for tonight's topic.
Right, trauma and chronic stress, and something that we've been experiencing prior to the pandemic. It's just once the pandemic hit, it's just exacerbated everything. And I love big emotions, and this is a big topic. And all of our topics in this series have been incredibly meaningful and important and big. And this one, I mean, so big that even recently the Surgeon General released a report, an advisory in an attempt to, for us to take action. It's, for children, I mean, it's unprecedented times in terms of pressures and stressors, and not only for children, but the parents, guardians, teachers, clinicians supporting them. I wanted to read just one short excerpt from the report, if I may. Everyone has a role to play in combating this mental health pandemic. Without individual engagement, no amount of energy or resources can overcome the biggest barrier to mental health care, which is the stigma associated with seeking help. For too long, mental and emotional health has been considered, at best, the absence of disease, and at worst, a shame to be hidden and ignored. So thank you, Dan and Ann, for having this conversation and talking about it. And thank you to PBS North and WDSE for creating a space for us to have this conversation.
For sure.
It's super important. So,
to comment on
Please.
one aspect of what you just read, I think the pandemic is a bit of an umbrella that has allowed us to say, I'm struggling with mental health of some sort. My child is struggling to adjust to this. I'm struggling to know how to parent under these conditions. Folks who may not have come forward and said so, or sought out help, or talked to their neighbor or their own parent about what do I do here? The pandemic is a stressor for all of us that we all acknowledge. And so it's, I think, given more people a chance to step forward and say, hey, let's go finally engage with a therapist or a counselor or what have you.
beautiful. Yeah. Making meaning out of tragedy.
For sure.
Is definitely happening. So, well, we'll jump in right away to our questions. So, Anne, we'll start with you. When my child is having big feelings, anxiety, anger, sadness, and or behaviors such as aggression, withdrawal, crying episodes, trauma, what can I do to help?
I think that that's an excellent question, and I see parents really struggling to figure that out with all of these, like you said, unprecedented times and all of these really big things that are happening in the world, that being a kid is hard, and being a kid in a pandemic is so difficult. And parents, I see parents really wanting to help support their children and not exactly knowing what to do. And so I think one of the first things that parents can do is really, the first thing that they can do, and one of the most effective things that they can do, is tune into themselves and really understand and identify where their feelings are. And if they can have a calming presence, that is going to be one of the best things for their children, to calm them through those big feelings and big emotions, and really give space and validate that all feelings are okay. It's okay that kids are feeling sad or stressed or scared. There's a lot of big things happening in the world, and so validating that and naming it can be really powerful.
Excellent, thank you. Dan, anything you want to add? Because I know you had mentioned kind of the parents and modeling
For
that
sure.
behavior, like Ann said.
Anne's absolutely right. The cliche that we say as much with our behavior or more than with our words is absolutely true. So when we're modeling stress, frustration, anger, to be aware of it and put into words why. It was hard for me to again this month be working from home. So that your child hears you putting words to what's stressful for you. That's a good model for them. There's license to acknowledge their own difficult feelings, right? If I'm feeling stressed, then Junior has as much of an opportunity to say that as well. And then self-regulation is important as well. I think of one of the goals of parenting in any situation is promoting increased self-regulation as our children develop, right? And if we're modeling dysregulation because we're frustrated, we're excessively anxious, et cetera, and we're not putting that into words, that's actually what we're teaching, regardless of what we're saying. And even though the pandemic is unprecedented in our lifetime, general principles still apply. Good parenting is about modeling, it's about communication, it's about unconditional positive regard, it's about maintaining expectations. So I understand you're tired of another semester of school on Zoom, and I expect you to do your best. So both pairs seem awfully important.
That's great.
Yeah.
And speaking of working from home, one of our first questions just came in. Zoom meetings are even affecting me as an adult. How do you help children who are Zoom fatigued when it's hard to even help yourself? Anne, we start with you, and I know you've done some amazing, creative, engaging work in telehealth with children.
Yeah.
I hope you'll touch on that.
I think that is a spot-on question, because as adults, and I do a lot of virtual therapy, we feel it. It's a lot to be on the screen for many hours a day. And one of the biggest things that parents can do is get really creative and add some movement in for kids. And so making sure, how are they learning over Zoom? How are they learning virtually? What is the situation or the setup that would be helpful to add some movement into their day or into the class? So it might be sitting on a yoga ball, it might be getting up every chunk of time and doing something fun, creative, and playful, like maybe a dance break or something where they can move their body, where they're not sitting for the entire day. So that's one of the things that we can do to help with the Zoom meetings and the Zoom fatigue.
Excellent. Yeah. Anything?
I'll echo the need for movement breaks. I think they're even more important than in a traditional classroom, probably. Learning on a screen or via a screen requires a different kind of concentration and self-regulation than you have when you're in a classroom. So a child who's gotten really good at doing it in the classroom won't automatically do it well in an online environment. So again, just speaking the truth out loud, this is harder, isn't it? You have to learn different strategies, don't you? Let's talk about what you can do. Movement breaks make a ton of sense. Talking with your student's teacher and saying, we may turn our screen off at times so that my child's self-consciousness gets a break. So that he can go and pay attention to what's going on in the other room, because his sibling is over there doing it too, and he wants to check in and see how he's doing. Communicating with teachers, allowing the conversation to get to what's hard about this or uniquely hard about it, movement breaks, and then when school is over, lots of opportunity to be in your large muscles, right? And doing something that doesn't make a lot of cognitive demand, because it's a different cognitive demand, again, to learn in a virtual environment.
Thank you. Dr. Thompson from Beaver Bay asks, what is the result of masking on adolescents? What's the effect on their mental health? Interesting. Dan, do you want to?
I don't know the research on it. I have anecdotal sense of it. Do you know any research on this?
The research that I know is about social cues more than about the mental health effects. What the research says about social cues, because I was very interested with masks of how children, especially young children, are going to pick up and interpret social cues and what that result for kids was going to be. And the research actually is pretty encouraging in that kids pick up social cues just as much as they would if somebody was wearing sunglasses. So not obviously as much as we'd like them to. We're missing half of the face, but social cues, kids can still pick up quite a bit of social cues. So I think one of the fears in the pandemic was how much are they going to lose the learning and the interpretation and the social connections and cues, and we know that there is some lost, but not as significant as amount as I was worried about. But I don't have any knowledge of the research on the emotional and mental health beyond the anecdotes that I also am getting into my office.
The research you cite is very encouraging, I have to agree. I'll add just anecdotally that children who tended to struggle with reading social cues to begin with struggled more in the pandemic, and the kids who were good at it tended to adjust better. One thing the pandemic did in so many ways is sort of widen the gaps between kids of various abilities, whether it's academic or social and emotional intelligence or what have you. So.
Thank you. Yeah. Anne, how do I help my child when so much in their lives are unpredictable and unknown? COVID isolation, school decision-making tree, and so on.
I think that is definitely one of the unprecedented things within this pandemic, is that we don't know when the end point is going to come. We don't know what that looks like. There's nothing certain that we can really ground ourselves in. And so with all of that uncertainty comes a lot of distress for children. Children thrive under structure. Children thrive when they know exactly what to expect and exactly what's expected of them and what's going to happen next. And in all of this chaos that's happening, whether we're virtual, in person for school, events that are canceled that we thought we might be able to go to, it's a lot for a child. And so one of the things that I think parents can do that can be the most helpful and supportive to their children is to validate. I think we've been talking about that, validate how distressing and tough this is. And there's a lot of grief, I think, that happens within the pandemic and canceled events. But as much as you can as a parent, orient to structure. What's happening today? What's happening tomorrow? What do we know for sure is going to be going on in our lives? And really, as parents, talk into that and help kids understand what life looks like in the short term, and then figure out how to be creative in adding things that are fun, exciting, engaging, and bringing families together that are under your control, that can't be canceled or taken away by any sort of shift that might happen with the pandemic.
Excellent. Well, and speaking of, I'm just going to kind of jump into the next question, and Dan, I would love your feedback as well, but with movement breaks, for instance, like we just talked about, one of our viewers asked, how do we encourage children to be excited about this, especially even teens who are often on phones, computers, screens, and so on? When you mention being creative.
Yes.
What?
I think that in order for kids to be excited about it, you as the parent have to be excited about it. If you are coming into this and you're not quite sure if it's going to work, or you're bringing energy that you're not quite clear of, like, you know, how this is going to all work out, you're going to bring that to the child, and they're going to pick that up. Kids read our social cues and our energy so quickly. And I would say get creative, but also get their buy-in. Ask them. Say, what do you think would be helpful for you to get some movement here? What would be helpful for you? What would be exciting for you? What would be fun for you to get some of that movement and to get just I like to call it like discharge all the energy that you have from sitting all day. You can do a lot of creative things. I always go to Pinterest, which is a treasure trove of ideas, which is legit.
Indeed.
But you can like write things on popsicle sticks and pick one out. You can have a little jar that it's a surprise, and there's an element of kind of the unknown that gets kids really, really excited. And so really ask your kid, but there's a lot of ways to brainstorm and bringing your own good positive energy to it.
Yeah, makes me think about all that co-regulating and your
Yeah.
enthusiasm, the mirroring that, like it's a theme that we've been talking about, our Dan, anything to add?
Again, I'd second what Ann had to say, and I'd amplify it by saying new circumstances are opportunities to learn new things about ourselves and develop new skills, and they're often opportunities to talk about values. So how in an online learning environment, let's say, how can you discover something new about yourself? You can be patient, being, without your classmates near you, but you have to listen to them talk through something, for example. And it might be easier when you can kind of look around the classroom, but when you're in your sterile room at home and your classmates talking a long time, how can you discover a new way to self-regulate and be patient? How can you be supportive of your friend who seems to be struggling from a distance? What new skills can you develop around this, and how can you discover new ways to express your values? So we think of pandemic conditions as restricting, but they can also support a sort of blossoming of what you understand yourself as capable to do. And again, that comes from parents. If parents have an attitude, right, of this stinks, I can't wait till it's over, it's all loss, then that's generally going to be where our kids start from.
Excellent, thank you. Anne, next question. Wonderful questions from the viewers, thank you. And if you are just tuning in, we're having a beautiful discussion on children's mental health and the pandemic. Do you think there will be lasting effects on children's mental health for years to come following this pandemic?
I would say with certainty, absolutely. And that's a really hard truth to hold. But to be asking children to completely change the way that they operate within the world is really, really difficult. And if we think about the kids who were at their elementary years, they're just starting to learn to read, they're just starting to learn to write, and we're thinking about maybe the kindergarten through second graders, they're trying to learn all these foundational skills on Zoom or virtual or missing time periods. And then we have the middle schoolers going into high school where there's a lot of in-person social dynamics that are really important for social skills development, that they're also having a really different experience of that. And then the grief and loss. I think about a lot of the seniors that I'm seeing who maybe graduated and didn't get to experience a prom, or didn't get to do the activities that they were looking so forward to in high school, like playing on sports teams or going to dances or things like that. And so there's just so much developmentally that the pandemic has placed on children that I do believe it will be years before we see the full effects, and also we'll be holding this for years to come. I also think in that kids are resilient. So I don't want to miss that. If we hold that the pandemic does impact kids, it will impact kids, it will impact their mental health, they're also resilient, and I don't want us to lose sight of that either.
Wonderful. Dan, how about the media, the news, so on and so forth? How much or little would you recommend that children and parents are exposed to?
So that's so individualistic. I think it really requires a parent to know what's in their child's best interest. Probably the middle of the bell curve is not a lot. Like your starting point ought to be not a lot of exposure to media around this. But whatever the level of exposure, particularly, if you have a child who's especially interested and is very verbal about what he or she sees on media, then maybe more. But always talking through, what'd you hear today? What'd you see today? What sense do you make of it? How does it square with what you thought was going on out in the world? How does that affect you? What emotions does it bring up? It's hard to go wrong with questions. So probably not a lot of exposure to media, but read your child. dial it back or dial it up as your child expresses an interest or shows difficulty handling what they're learning in the media. And then always conversation about it.
Checking in.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And kind of along those lines, Anthony from Virginia asks, does too much of electronics affect my child's mental health? So I know we get a lot at our practice, a lot of questions about screen time, and I think some of the research has shown that it's a little bit less about the time and more about the content and so on. But anything that you could share about?
Yeah, I think that is so complex, Dina, like you're saying. It's what are they watching, how are they watching it, and I'm really interested in how they're engaging with it. And so is it a time that they're going on autopilot and it's almost like mindless scrolling? And that's very different than some of the teens that I have that have online communities of friends and they co-game together and they have these communities and these relationships online where they're getting a lot of social needs met from that. So I think that really figuring out how are they consuming media and also how is it affecting them? Because I think, like you said, with the media, taking in news media, it's the same thing with video games and technology. There are some kids who are able to know their limits, observe when it's getting to be too much. They can put it down, they can step away. And there are other young people where it truly becomes an addiction where they're not able to set it down and they're not able to put it away. And what is the impact of that? What are they missing and what is the effect in their life? And that's usually what I focus on when we're talking about media use, and are we in that range that feels regulated and feels like a healthy amount, or are we in that space where it feels dysregulating? Like there's a lot of big emotions getting off. There's things that the child isn't doing because they're on media.
Wonderful.
Can I amplify
Please.
that last point? I really like your emphasis on individualizing your sense of how much media and under what circumstances fits each child.
Yeah.
But what's not happening when they're on screens? What developmentally appropriate or necessary tasks are they not doing? What large motor tasks are they not doing, or socializing, or going to church, or sitting with the rest of the family at meals, or getting to sleep on time? Right?
Yeah.
I think it's easy to let what's replaced by screen time become invisible to us. And I think the research I'm familiar with suggests that we got awful worried about the content of violent video games and such, and we should be attentive to that. But the research suggests that the content might be less important than what's being replaced by video games. So I think attention to that, and attention to the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines of 2 hours of screen time per day for kids, none below, I want to say age 2.
2.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think that's smart too.
Beautiful. Thank you. And I can't believe we're almost out of time. This went by so fast, and it is such a big topic. So I'm at this last question, I'm really excited that somebody asked it, because I think it's important to share with viewers resources and where to go. So the question is, what are my options for therapy for my child? What would you say to someone looking for, I need more? I have more questions, after seeing this program, and I think I want to learn more and need help, either myself or my child. What would you recommend?
If you have access to the internet, I would Google mental health help for children in the Twin Ports or in Duluth and sort of start there. There is a burgeoning number of therapists available in the Twin Ports. It's wonderful news. There's increasing access. There's lots of people who can be helpful to you and your family. And don't be afraid to be a consumer, to shop around for the person who feels like the right fit for you and your family. You don't have to settle for the first person that you happen to make a connection with.
I love that, because research shows that the relationship that you have with your therapist is the #1 factor for change. And so if clients aren't feeling connected with their therapist, if kids don't feel like their therapist is somebody they can talk to or somebody who gets them, they're not going to put their walls down enough to open up. And like jumping off of that, I really think that depending on the age of the kid, and the child might need a different type of therapy. And so the therapy that I provide for teens is very different than the therapy that I provide for small children. So you also want to make sure that it's developmentally appropriate, whatever therapist you're looking into. How are you going to speak the language of how old that child is? So for an example, I love play therapy for kids 8, 9, and under, and more talk-based therapy for kids that are a little older.
Wonderful. Just maybe one more question, and I'm not even quite sure the context of this one, but let's give it a shot. And this is Mike from Hibbing. Thank you. Should I plan mental health days for my child? Dan.
Again, I think that depends on your read of your child. Sometimes a child knowing there's a mental health day on the horizon can be really valuable. It can help your child gut out a tough day at school. On the other hand, it might be nice to have those as surprises for a different sort of child. And it might also make sense to not plan anything at all and just see if your kid can learn that, hey, I can do this. Again, I don't need to know there's a break, or the weekend is break enough. So I guess my generic advice would be read your child, try to understand what he or she needs as best you can, and do it only if it seems pretty indicated.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan and Anne, Dr. Dan DeAllard and Anne Meehan, for their time and expertise tonight. And to the WDSE staff members for answering the phones, and for those of you who called in or emailed questions. Please join Dr. Mary Owen next week for a program on end of life and advanced care planning, when her guests will be Dr. Jeff Coatman and Dr. Amy Greminger. I'm Dina Clabaugh. For the guests and crew here at WDSE, thank you for watching. Good night.